The night Clarence Barlow rode out of Redemption Creek, Ada Redmond did not cry. She stood on the front porch of the house she had built with her own 2 hands, and she lit the lantern that hung from the beam above the door, and she watched his silhouette dissolve into the black throat of the Nevada desert like smoke into nothing. She did not call after him. She did not beg. She was not built for begging, and he had always known that about her, and she had always believed that knowing it would be enough to make him stay. She had been wrong about very few things in her 28 years of living, but she had been catastrophically, devastatingly wrong about that. The lantern burned. The flame was steady and golden inside its glass chimney, and the night wind moved around the porch but could not reach it, and Ada stood there with her arms folded across her chest, and her jaw set hard, and her dark eyes fixed on the horizon where Clarence had been and was no longer, and she did not move. She could feel the betrayal settling into her chest like a stone thrown into still water, heavy and irreversible, sending out rings that touched every corner of her. He had sworn to her, in this very spot, 2 weeks before, that he was different from what people said about him. He had held her face in both his scarred hands and looked at her with those gray eyes that had always told her more truth than his mouth ever did, and he had said he wanted to try to stay. And now he was gone, and the lantern burned, and Ada Redmond made herself a promise standing there in the dark. She would not extinguish it. She would let it burn until she ran out of oil, and if he did not come back before the oil was gone, she would fill it again and light it again, because she was not a woman who surrendered, not to drought, not to crooked land agents, not to grief, and not to a man who did not yet understand the magnitude of what he was walking away from. She had survived too much to quit now. She would let that light burn like a signal fire, like a declaration, like a dare. What she could not have known, standing there in the dark of that October night in 1883, was that Clarence Barlow had already stopped his horse. That he was sitting out there in the blackness less than a quarter mile from her property line, unable to make himself go any farther, one hand loose on the reins and the other pressed flat against his chest, where something inside him was pulling in a direction he had never once in his life allowed himself to follow. He sat there and breathed and stared back at the small, warm glow of her porch light, and told himself it meant nothing. He had told himself a great many lies over the years. The story of how a sworn drifter and the most capable woman in Lander County, Nevada, came to stand on opposite sides of an unspoken war, and how that war was finally, irreversibly lost by both of them, did not begin on that October night. It began 7 months earlier, on a Wednesday in March, when Clarence rode into Redemption Creek with 52 cents to his name, a bullet crease along his left ribs that had gone septic, and absolutely no intention of stopping anywhere longer than it took to buy a meal and steal a night's sleep. Redemption Creek was not a town that inspired lingering. It sat at the foot of the Toyabe Range in central Nevada, where the desert flattened itself out into scrub and alkali dust, and the wind came down off the mountains with a mean, personal quality that suggested it had a grudge. The town had a main street with 8 buildings on it, a livery, a general store run by a man named Briggs who overcharged for everything and underdelivered on quality, a saloon called the Blue Sage that served whiskey of uncertain provenance, and a small whitewashed building that served as both post office and courthouse, depending on which judge happened to be passing through. What Redemption Creek also had, and what Clarence discovered the hard way approximately 40 minutes after arriving, was a woman named Ada Redmond who ran the only medical practice within 60 miles, and who did not suffer fools, wounded or otherwise, gladly. He had gone to the Blue Sage first, because that was the order a man in his condition naturally followed whiskey before doctoring, always, and he had made it approximately 2 drinks in before the wound in his side made its displeasure with that decision definitively known, by causing him to slide off the bar stool in a manner that was not quite graceful. The saloon keeper, A large man named Hector Voss, who had seen a great deal in his years behind the bar, looked at the blood spreading darkly through the left side of Clarence's shirt and pointed wordlessly at the door. "Ada Redmond," Voss said. "Blue house at the end of the North Fork. Go now or don't go at all." Clarence went, though he would have phrased it differently. He stumbled was more accurate. He led his horse, a big gray roan he called Judas because the animal had an unerring talent for getting him into trouble, and he walked the half-mile to the North Fork of the main road and found the blue house, which was indeed blue, a particular sharp and confident shade of blue that looked like a deliberate choice rather than leftover paint. And he found the front porch with its hanging lantern already lit against the late afternoon dimness, and he knocked on the door. The woman who answered it was not what he expected. He had not formed a precise expectation, which was his habit, because expectations had a way of disappointing. But if he had been asked to guess what a frontier doctor looked like, he would not have pictured Ada Redmond. She was of medium height, with dark hair pulled back from her face in a severe and practical fashion, and dark eyes that were currently performing what felt like a comprehensive structural assessment of him in approximately 3 seconds. She was wearing a plain canvas work apron over a dark wool dress, and her sleeves were already rolled to the elbows, and there was something about the complete absence of surprise on her face that told him she had been expecting someone like him, not him specifically, but someone in his condition which he supposed was an ordinary Wednesday for her. "Come inside," she said. No greeting, no preamble. He came inside. The room she brought him to was clean and well lit by 2 oil lamps, and arranged with an efficiency that suggested serious professional thought. There were glass-fronted cabinets along one wall with labeled bottles and instruments behind them. There was an examination table that she directed him toward with a gesture that brokered no argument. There was a small stove in the corner with water already heating, which suggested she had assessed the situation through the door before opening it. "Shirt off," she said, washing her hands at the basin near the window. "How do you do? I'm Clarence Barlow," he said, because some instinct in him resisted the idea of being simply a wound on a table, even in his current diminished state. She glanced at him briefly over her shoulder with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite impatience, but somewhere architecturally between them. "Ada Redmond. Shirt, Mr. Barlow." He got the shirt off, which cost him a significant amount of the dignity he had left, and she crossed to the table and looked at the wound with the same unhurried, comprehensive assessment she had given him at the door. She touched the skin around it with 2 fingers, and whatever she was testing for, she found it, because she nodded once to herself with the satisfied air of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "This has been infected for at least 4 days, she said. "You've been riding with this for 4 days. 3.5, he said. "You have a very precise relationship with your own suffering. I have a very imprecise relationship with stopping," he said. She looked at him then fully, and there was something in her expression that shifted slightly, a calibration, as though she had filed that piece of information somewhere for later. Then she turned to her cabinet and began selecting things from it with the quick, decisive movements of a person who had long since converted her knowledge into muscle memory. What followed was not pleasant. Ada Redmond cleaned and debrided an infected bullet wound with the same focused, unhurried competence with which he imagined she approached everything, and she did not flinch at what she found, and she did not make soothing noises, and she did not apologize for the pain. She did, however, talk to him, which he later realized had been a deliberate strategy to keep him conscious and still. She asked him where he'd come from. He said south. She asked what had caused the wound. He said a misunderstanding. She made a sound that conveyed approximately 15 kinds of skepticism compressed into 1 syllable and told him she needed him to hold very still. He held very still. "You'll need to stay off your horse for at least a week," she said, when she was finished, when his side was cleaned and packed and wrapped in clean linen, and the evidence of what had been a genuinely serious infection was now being addressed with a preparation she had made herself from dried plants in labeled jars. "The infection hasn't spread to the blood yet, but it will if you ride tomorrow." "I'll be gone by morning," he said. Ada Redmond looked at him with an expression that he would come to know very well over the following months, a particular combination of intelligence and patience that suggested she was being very courteous in not saying the obvious thing. "You will be gone by morning if you don't mind dying on the road somewhere between here and wherever you imagine you need to be," she said. "That is, of course, your prerogative." He did not leave by morning. This was partly because, when he attempted to rise at first light, his body staged what could only be described as a full revolt, and partly because he found himself in a clean bed in a spare room at the back of Ada's house with no memory of how he'd gotten there, and the fever that had been quietly building while he was riding had now decided to make its presence vigorously known. Ada brought him water and broth and medicine at regular intervals throughout that day and the next, with the same efficient competence she applied to everything, and she did not hover, and she did not fuss, and she maintained a professional and courteous distance that was so thoroughly impersonal it should have felt cold but somehow did not. When he was coherent enough to be curious about it, he asked her, on the second day, how she'd come to be a doctor in a place like this. She was sitting in the chair beside the window doing something with a mortar and pestle, grinding something fragrant and medicinal, and she answered without looking up. "I trained under Dr. Evelyn Cross in San Francisco for 3 years, and before that I learned what I could from books, and before that I grew up on a ranch in eastern Oregon, where the nearest doctor was 4 days' ride and people learned to handle things themselves." "A woman doctor," he said, not meaning it as a challenge, simply turning the fact over. "An accurate observation," she said. "People give you trouble about it." "People give me trouble about everything," she said, with a tone that was entirely unbothered. "I find that being better at it than anyone else in 60 miles tends to settle the argument." He laughed, which hurt his ribs considerably, and she glanced at him over her work with an expression that was almost a smile. He stayed for a week, then 10 days because the infection, though retreating, was stubborn, and the terrain of Lander County in March was unforgiving, and Ada Redmond had made her medical opinion on the subject extremely clear. He stayed in the spare room and he mended and he watched, because watching was one of the few things he'd always been genuinely good at, and what he watched was Ada Redmond working. She was extraordinary. He arrived at this conclusion the way he arrived at most truths about the world, slowly and through accumulated evidence rather than sudden revelation. And by the end of the first week, he had a body of evidence that was difficult to argue with. She ran her practice with the kind of disciplined intelligence that he associated with the best military commanders he'd encountered, men who understood that competence was not a quality to be modest about when lives depended on it. She could diagnose at a glance things that would have stumped physicians he'd seen in city hospitals. She kept meticulous records in a small leather-bound journal she carried in her apron pocket. She compounded her own medications, and the preparations she made from local plants showed a knowledge of desert botany that was, as far as he could determine, entirely self-taught and exceptional. She also, he discovered on his 4th day there, ran a cattle operation on the 40 acres behind her house, not a large one, a manageable herd of 18 cattle and 4 horses, but she managed it herself with the help of a part-time hand named Eli, who was 14 and deeply devoted to her, and who came in on weekday afternoons. He watched from the window of his room one afternoon as she worked with 2 cattle that had gotten tangled in fence wire, and what he saw dismantled something he had been half-consciously carrying for years, some received assumption about what a woman could manage alone in hard country. She was quick and precise and utterly fearless with the animals, and she read the situation and solved it with an economy of movement that came from deep, practiced knowledge. He found himself wanting to talk to her. This was unusual. He had organized his life, deliberately and with considerable effort, around not wanting things that required other people. He had been on the road for 9 years since he was 22, moving through New Mexico and Texas and Colorado and Utah and Nevada, working cattle drives, working track crews, working anything that paid for the next meal and the next road, and he had been very committed to the project of wanting nothing, of keeping himself light and unattached, because attachment was how men got trapped, and trapping was a thing he had developed a specific, instructional fear of. He knew where that fear came from. He did not enjoy knowing it, but he knew it. His father had been a man of violent certainties and small geography, a man who had stayed in one place his entire life, and expressed all of his frustration at that fact through the bodies of the people nearest to him. Clarence had left the moment he was old enough and fast enough, and he had never stayed anywhere long enough to give that pattern room to repeat itself. He had decided at 22 that the staying was the danger, that if he kept moving, he kept himself clean of it. 9 years later, lying in a spare bed in a blue house in Redemption Creek, watching a woman he had known for 4 days set a fractured wrist with the confident hands of someone who had done it dozens of times, he was finding that his philosophy had a structural weakness he had not previously identified. He got up when he was strong enough. He sat on the porch in the weak March sun and watched the desert and breathed the cold, dry air. And Ada came out with 2 cups of coffee on the 3rd day of his being ambulatory, and sat in the other chair without asking if she was welcome, because she was on her own porch and did not require invitation. They drank coffee in silence for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was itself a remarkable thing because Clarence Barlow had not sat in comfortable silence with another person in longer than he could clearly remember. "You're going to leave," she said, not looking at him, looking at the flat line of the desert horizon. "When you're well." "That's generally what I do," he said. "Where will you go?" "Wherever the road goes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like a very elegant way of describing the absence of a plan." He looked at her. "Most people would call it freedom." "Most people call a lot of things by the wrong names," she said, and there was nothing harsh in it, only the flat precision of someone who had thought about language carefully. "Do you like it, the road?" He considered this with more honesty than he usually brought to the question. "I don't like stopping," he said finally. "That's different." "Yes," he said. "It is." She nodded once as though he had confirmed something she'd already worked out and took a long drink of coffee, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was also the beginning of something else, something neither of them named, which was wise, because naming things gave them the weight of expectations, and both of them had complicated relationships with expectation. He stayed another week, which he told himself was purely medical prudence. He began to eat his meals at her table instead of in the spare room. He found small, useful things to do on the property, fence repairs and water hauling and stable work, things that his hands wanted to do because idleness made them restless, and Ada let him do them without protest or excessive gratitude, which he found he appreciated deeply. They talked. At first in the practical, transactional way that strangers talk, and then in longer sentences, and then in the way that people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds talk, which is different in quality from any other conversation. He told her things he had not told anyone in years, not secrets. He was not ready for secrets, but observations, thoughts, the way the desert looked to him at different times of day, the logic of cattle movement, the things he'd read in whatever books and newspapers he'd managed to get hold of in his years of moving. She listened with a quality of attention that he found quietly devastating, because she was clearly actually hearing what he said and filing it away and making connections between things. And when she responded, her responses were always worth waiting for. She told him about her time in San Francisco, studying under Dr. Cross, who had been one of the few practicing women physicians in California, and who had taught Ada not only medicine, but the particular mental discipline required to be excellent at something in a world that preferred you to be merely adequate and quiet about it. She told him about her father's ranch in Oregon, and about learning to ride before she could read, and about the way the frontier had shaped her belief that a person, any person, who could not be competent in the physical world was a person at the mercy of it, and that mercy was unreliable. She did not tell him about the dark past that still visited her occasionally in the form of a particular sadness that settled behind her eyes on certain evenings. He noticed it. He did not ask. He had dark pasts of his own, and he understood that they were the sort of thing a person shared on their own schedule or not at all. He left at the end of that second week, on a clear Tuesday morning in mid-March with his side healed enough to ride, and his horse rested, and $60 in his pocket from work he'd done on a neighboring ranch's fence during his recovery. Ada stood on the porch and watched him saddle Judas, and when he was mounted, she came down the porch steps with a small wrapped package of the medicines she'd been using on his wound and handed them up to him. "Change the dressing every 2 days," she said. "With clean linen." "I know," he said. "You absolutely don't know," she said, "but I've said it so my conscience is clean." He looked at her for a moment in the thin morning light, with her dark eyes steady and her arms already crossed again in that posture that was armored but not cold, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want one. "Thank you," he said, "for the doctoring. Come back if it gets infected again," she said. "I don't come back to places," he said, and even as he said it he heard the formula of it, the rehearsed quality, and he thought she heard it too because something passed briefly across her face. "I know," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Barlow." He rode out. He got as far as Elko before he turned around. He told himself it was because he'd realized he'd left his good knife in the spare room, which was true. He had left the knife. He held this truth in front of himself like a lantern as he rode back, and if the lantern cast a light that was insufficient to fully explain why he'd gone back rather than simply replacing the knife, he did his best to ignore that. Ada opened the door when he knocked and looked at him with absolutely no expression that suggested she was surprised to see him, and said, "The knife is on the windowsill in the spare room." "Right," he said. "You should put it on your belt so you don't leave it places," she said, and stepped aside so he could come in and retrieve it. He retrieved the knife. He stayed for dinner. He stayed the night in the spare room because his side was aching from the ride to Elko and back, and that was a reasonable medical justification. He left the next morning and rode 60 miles north and got 3 weeks of work on a cattle drive moving stock out of the Humboldt Range. And he did the work with the focused competence he'd always been able to apply to physical labor, and he slept fine, and he ate fine. And every single morning he woke up before dawn in his bedroll and looked at the stars and thought about a blue house and a woman with dark eyes who ground her own medicines and answered the door in a canvas apron, and had never once in his presence looked like she needed rescuing from anything. He came back in April. He told himself he was passing through. Redemption Creek was not technically on the way to anywhere he was going, but the deviation was not extreme, he told himself, the way people tell themselves things that are not quite precisely true. Ada opened the door, and this time there was a very brief thing that happened in her expression before she controlled it, a flash of something that might have been relief or might have been satisfaction, or might have been something she didn't want him to see, and she said, "Your timing is reasonable. I need someone to help me move a cabinet." He moved the cabinet. He stayed a week. This pattern established itself over the following months with the logic of something that was not quite planned and not quite accidental, the way rivers find their courses through country that is both resistant and ultimately accommodating. He would leave, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for 6 weeks as the summer drove work to the ranches across the region, and he would return, and each time Ada would accept his return with the same composed practicality she brought to everything, finding him useful work, feeding him at her table, sitting with him on the porch in the evenings while the desert cooled and the stars emerged in their dense and serious abundance. They talked more deeply each time. The secrets began to surface, as they do between people who have decided, without quite deciding, to trust each other. He told her about his father. It came out one June evening, obliquely at first, and then with more directness than he'd intended, because Ada was the kind of listener who made obliqueness feel unnecessarily complicated, and he found himself describing the household he'd grown up in, the particular geography of fear that his father had constructed around everyone in it, the way leaving had felt not like abandonment but like survival. He expected her to offer comfort, which he would have found difficult to receive. She did not offer comfort. She said, "That explains the road," in a tone that was entirely without judgment, only recognition, and then she said, "It doesn't have to be the final explanation, though." And then she said nothing else and let the statement sit there in the quiet evening air between them, where it settled like something he'd been waiting for permission to consider. She told him about her husband. He had not known there was a husband, or had been one. His name had been Thomas Redmond, a cattle rancher from Oregon, a good man by her account, honest and hardworking and genuinely kind, who had died of typhoid fever 4 years ago, 18 months after they'd come to Nevada to start fresh. She had been 24. She had buried him on the ridge behind the blue house, which she had built, both of them together, over the previous summer. And after the burial she had gone inside and looked at the walls and the shelves and the window, and decided that the best way she knew how to grieve was to make herself so competent and so necessary that death would have to work very hard to come for anyone she cared about again. She had written to Dr. Cross in San Francisco, whose friendship she had maintained, and Dr. Cross had come and spent 3 months in Redemption Creek, and when she left, she had left Ada with a working medical practice and the means to stock it. "You built this house," he said, looking at the solid blue walls around them. "Thomas and I built it," she said. "He built more of it than I did, honestly. He was better with the timber work. I was better with the planning. And you kept it." "Of course I kept it," she said simply. "It's mine." He looked at her in the lamplight of the kitchen table where they were sitting, and he felt it again, that thing in his chest, but stronger now, informed by months of accumulated knowing, and he thought that he had never in his life met a person whose strength seemed so entirely integrated, so completely without performance. She was not strong in spite of loss or in defiance of it. She had made her strength from the raw material of everything that had happened to her, and the thing she had built was so solid and so genuinely hers that it made him acutely, almost painfully aware of the comparative lightness of his own existence, the way 9 years of not stopping had not built anything at all. The moment that broke something permanently open between them happened in late July, and it happened fast, the way important things often do. A man named Corbin Drax came to Redemption Creek. He arrived with 2 hired men and a piece of paper from the Lander County Land Office, claiming that Ada Redmond's 40 acres had been surveyed incorrectly, and that the corrected survey placed the eastern boundary of her property 4 acres short of where she understood it to be, which would put the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her land, the creek that watered her cattle and supplied her household, on county land that Drax had apparently managed to lease. Drax was the kind of man that frontier Nevada produced with depressing regularity, someone who understood that the paperwork infrastructure of land ownership in newly settled territory was full of ambiguities that could be exploited by someone with a territorial surveyor in his pocket and a lawyer in Reno. He was not violent, not visibly so, but he had the easy confidence of a man who expected to win, because he had always arranged things so that he would. He came to Ada's door with his paper and his hired men, and explained the situation with the polished courtesy of someone delivering news they knew would be devastating and enjoying the delivery. Clarence was there, had been there for 2 weeks, and he was at the fence on the north side of the property when he saw Drax arrive, and he walked back to the house in the unhurried way of a man who is moving faster than he appears to be. He expected to find Ada distressed. He expected the particular helpless shock that most people showed when the ground was pulled out from under them. What he found was Ada at the table with Drax's document spread in front of her, and the expression on her face was not distress. It was the focused, precise expression she wore when she was looking at something she intended to understand completely before she formed an opinion about it. She read the document twice. Then she said, "When was this survey conducted?" Drax said, "Last month, ma'am, by a licensed." "I can see who conducted it," Ada said, not looking up. "Mr. Haskins, who I also note conducted the original survey 4 years ago. Interesting that he found a discrepancy now and not then." Drax smiled the smile of a man who had this answer ready. "Survey technology improves, ma'am. These things happen." Ada said, in a tone that she used when she was not accepting something someone had said. She folded the document carefully and set it down and looked at Drax directly. "Give me 3 days. I'm afraid the county." "Give me 3 days," she said again, with a quality of finality that made Drax blink. "You'll have my response by Friday." Drax left, looking slightly less comfortable than he'd arrived. Clarence watched him go and then turned to Ada and said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to disprove it," she said, already moving to the shelf where she kept her own journals and records. "Ada, surveying disputes in this territory. I know exactly what they are," she said, pulling down a large flat journal he had not seen before. "I know because I read about them when we first came here, because land documentation in newly settled territories is notoriously vulnerable to manipulation, and I wanted to understand our position. I have the original survey on file, and I have something else." She opened the journal on the table. He looked. It was a meticulous series of hand-drawn maps, detailed, carefully measured, annotated in her precise handwriting, covering her entire property in multiple overlapping views. "What is this?" he said. "I survey my own land every spring," she said. "I have done it for 3 years with this." She crossed to the cabinet he had helped her move in April and opened the lower door and produced a brass surveyor's transit on its wooden legs, battered but functional. "My father was a surveyor before he was a cattleman. He taught me. I have 3 years of measurements, all dated and documented, and they will demonstrate that my eastern boundary has not moved." Clarence Barlow stared at her. He had seen a great deal in 9 years on the frontier. He was not easily surprised. But he stood in Ada Redmond's kitchen looking at 3 years of meticulous survey maps and a surveyor's transit that she had operated herself and stored in her cabinet next to her medical supplies, and he felt something shift in him so completely and so permanently that he knew even as it happened that it was a before and after, that he would divide his life into the time before this moment and the time after it. It was not that he thought her incapable. He had not thought that since approximately his first week in her house. It was that this specific capability, this particular forward-thinking, intelligent, preemptive documentation of her own position against precisely the kind of threat that now faced her, was so completely and specifically hers, so much the expression of a mind that was extraordinary in the most quiet and effective way, that it broke through something he had been holding very carefully for months and left him standing in her kitchen, feeling the full weight of what he had been carrying and calling lightness. "Ada," he said, "I'll need 3 days to compile the documentation," she said, not looking up, already working. "Ada," he said again. She looked up. Whatever she saw in his face made her go very still. "I need you to know," he said, and then stopped, because the sentence had more weight in it than he'd expected and he needed a moment to carry it. "I need you to know that I have never met anyone like you." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had been not quite saying since March. "Clarence," she said carefully, "don't say things you don't intend to mean." "I mean every word," he said. "I have meant every word I've said to you since the beginning." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that could see into things, and then she said, "Then help me organize these maps. I have a land dispute to win." He helped her organize the maps. She won the land dispute. She presented her documentation to the county recorder in Austin 3 days later. 50 miles east over a rough road that they rode together, and the county recorder, a methodical man named Prescott who had been in the job for 11 years and who cared primarily about the integrity of the records, looked at Ada's 3 years of dated, consistent, professionally executed surveys, and looked at Drax's single survey from 1 month ago, and made his decision in approximately 20 minutes. The eastern boundary of Ada Redmond's property was confirmed as originally recorded. Drax left Redemption Creek. He did not leave quietly, and before he left, he said things in the saloon that were the kind of things men said when they had lost at something they thought they had won before it started, but he left, and the creek stayed on Ada's land, and that was what mattered. The ride back from Austin was long and warm, and the desert was showing the first signs of the heat breaking toward late summer, the sky going that particular deep blue of early evening in Nevada, and they rode side by side and talked with the easy freedom of people who have recently won something together. Somewhere on that road, in the dying light of the day, Clarence reached across the space between their horses and took Ada's hand, and she looked at him, and she turned her hand so their fingers were properly interlaced, and neither of them said anything, and the horses walked on. Back in Redemption Creek, things changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that the town could have precisely pointed to, but they changed. He stayed longer between his departures. He took on more of the regular work of the property. He began to feel, when he was away on a cattle drive or a working trip, the specific pull of a specific direction, not north or south or east or west, but toward the blue house and the lantern on the porch, and the woman who was there doing her extraordinary work with or without him, and who had never once made him feel that his coming and going was something she was merely tolerating. There were 2 more brief departures in August and September, and each return felt different from the one before, less like a man passing through and more like a man coming home, which was a word he had been very careful with for 9 years and was now finding himself unable to fully avoid. He and Ada existed in a tender and careful space, one that had been made by 2 people who were both extremely conscious of the cost of making the wrong assumptions, who both understood that what they had was fragile in the specific way that precious things are fragile, not weak but requiring care. They were careful with each other. They were honest with each other, which is different from careful and more difficult. They had long evenings on the porch and long conversations at the kitchen table, and the particular quiet nights, when both of them simply existed in the same room without needing to fill it with sound. Ada kissed him first, which surprised neither of them, on a warm September evening when they were both on the porch watching a thunderstorm build in the mountains, and the air was full of the smell of coming rain, and she simply turned toward him and kissed him with the same direct certainty she brought to everything, no hesitation, no performance, just the clear and deliberate expression of a thing she had decided she wanted. He held her face in both his scarred hands and kissed her back with a thoroughness that said everything he had not yet found words for. But the road was still in him. That was the truth he'd been circling, the central problem of Clarence Barlow, the thing that made him lie awake some nights in the spare room that had long since stopped feeling spare and stare at the ceiling and feel the familiar restlessness start at his feet and work its way up, the compulsive pull of movement, of not staying, of the version of safety that he had constructed from a childhood of trapped and terrible stillness. He was not his father. He knew this. Ada had never made him feel for a single moment like staying would turn him into something dangerous. But the fear that it might was not rational, and he was self-aware enough to know that, and being self-aware enough to know a fear is irrational is not the same as being free of it. The crisis came in October, 3 weeks after the night he'd kissed her on the porch in the rain, on an evening when he came back from a week-long working trip north to find a letter on the table that Ada had received from a man named Silas Cross in Denver, a cattle broker who was offering significant work coordinating stock movement through Colorado for the winter season. Months of well-paying, steady work with enough to set a man up comfortably come spring. Sela's Cross was not, as it happened, related to Dr. Evelyn Cross, and the letter had nothing to do with Ada except that it had been sent to her address, because it was the only address Clarence had that stayed consistent, which was itself a fact that he had not fully absorbed the implications of, until he held the letter and looked at the handwriting of his own name on the envelope. Ada had left the letter on the table and gone about her work, and Clarence sat with it and felt the old machinery engage, the gears of his accustomed response, the reach for distance and movement and road. The offer was good. Colorado in winter was hard, but the work was honest. He could be gone by morning. He could be gone by morning. He went into the room where Ada was working, writing up patient notes from the afternoon, and he told her about the letter. He told her what the offer was. He watched her face, which was entirely composed, because Ada Redmond had never once looked to him like someone who would hold on to something that did not want to be held. "It sounds like good work," she said. "It's months," he said, "through winter." "I know," she said, and looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want?" And there was the question. The fair, honest, perfectly crafted question from a woman who would never give him a dishonest answer and never ask him to be what he wasn't, and who also would never, he knew this absolutely, pretend that his going wouldn't cost her something. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. She nodded. "Then you should go and find out," she said, with a gentleness that was devastating in its precision, because it was the gentleness of someone who had decided to love him on his own terms even when those terms were difficult. He went. He packed his kit and saddled Judas and rode out on a Thursday evening in October, and Ada stood on the front porch with her arms folded and watched him go, and the lantern above the door burned steadily in its glass chimney. He rode a quarter-mile and stopped. He sat on Judas in the dark of the Nevada desert and looked back at the small, warm glow of her porch light, and he breathed the cold October air, and he felt the road ahead of him and the light behind him, and he understood, in the way that you understand things that have been obvious for a long time and have only been waiting for you to stop running long enough to see them, that he had already made his choice. That he had made it months ago, possibly as early as that first March morning when he'd mounted up and she'd handed him the medicines and said, "Come back if it gets infected," and he'd said he didn't come back to places, and the lie had been immediately and completely transparent even to himself. He was not his father. Staying was not a prison. The blue house was not a cage. Ada Redmond was a woman of such thorough competence and such clear and independent strength that staying beside her would require him to be more of himself, not less, would ask more of him than the road ever had, would ask him to build something real in place of something simply unbroken. And he wanted to build something. He understood this now, sitting in the dark with his horse's warm sides moving against his legs, and the cold stars overhead, and that small brave light burning on the porch of the blue house that a woman had built with her own hands on the land she had documented and defended herself, in the town where she was irreplaceable, in the life she had made from loss and determination and extraordinary capability. He wanted to be part of that life. Not because he needed it to be whole, but because it was the best, most honest, most real thing he had ever been close to, and because she was. He turned Judas around. He rode back at a walk because there was no urgency now, because the decision was made and it was not going anywhere. He came back up the North Fork Road with the lantern growing larger and warmer as he approached, and he came into the yard, and Ada was still on the porch, still standing with the lamp burning above her head and the October stars behind her and her arms not folded now but loose at her sides. She had waited. She had not gone inside. She had stood there with that light burning and waited, and the sight of her standing there in the lamp glow with everything she was, everything she had survived and built and became, standing there making the active choice to remain visible to him even when she did not know if he would come back, broke open the last sealed thing in Clarence Barlow's chest and filled it with something he finally, after 29 years, allowed himself to call by its right name. He dismounted and tied Judas to the porch rail and climbed the steps and stood in front of her. And she looked at him with those dark eyes that had always, from the first moment in March, seen him more clearly than he saw himself. "I got a quarter-mile," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched until I couldn't see you." "Ada," he took her face in both hands the way he had on the porch in the September rain. "I am done leaving." She held very still under his hands. "That is a significant statement from a man who has defined himself by leaving." "I know it is," he said. "I mean it." "I need you to understand," she said with the serious precision that she brought to things that mattered, "that I am not asking you to stay. I am not going to ask you to stay. If you stay, it has to be because it is what you genuinely want." "I know," he said. "I want it." "Clarence," she said, and her voice had changed in a way it very rarely changed, lower and softer and stripped of the professional armor she wore so well, "you should know that I am frightened." "Of me?" "Of this," she said. "Of wanting it this much. Thomas died. I know how it feels when something you've built your whole life around is gone. I'm not comparing you to Thomas. That's not what I mean. I mean I know the cost of caring about something, and this." She stopped. Her jaw worked briefly. "You are not an easy thing to have decided to care about." He pulled her in. He held her with both arms, her face against his neck, and felt her breathe and felt her eventually, after a moment, lean into him in the way that people lean when they have decided to trust a thing. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that. I'm going to be better at it." "You don't need to be better at everything all at once," she said, which was such a perfectly Ada thing to say that he almost laughed. "Just start by staying." "I'm staying," he said. He stayed. The following months were the architecture of something new, something that neither of them could have fully designed in advance, which was fitting, because the best things in life, Ada once told him, were like the best medical diagnoses, not the ones you expected but the ones that turned out to be accurate. He moved his things properly into the blue house in November, which required 2 trips and prompted a conversation about the organization of the spare room that was the first domestic argument they had ever had, and which lasted approximately 20 minutes before they arrived at a mutual solution that they were both satisfied with. The spare room became, under the negotiated terms, his study, a room where he could read and keep his own things in his own disorder, and Ada's house became their house, not by announcement but by the natural accumulation of shared mornings and shared meals and shared evenings, and the way the space of a house absorbs the life of the people in it. He worked. He found work that kept him in Lander County, managing stock for the Harker Ranch 6 miles north, which was legitimate and well-paying and near enough that he could be home most nights. And on the days he was not at Harker's, he was on Ada's property, improving the fence line and building a better stable, and doing the physical work of the land with the competence and attention he'd always been able to bring to such things when he chose to point it somewhere. The town of Redemption Creek adjusted to the new situation with the practical acceptance of communities that cannot afford to refuse useful people. Hector Voss at the Blue Sage bought Clarence a drink the first time he came in for the winter, and told him without ceremony that the town was better for having him, which was approximately as effusive as Hector Voss ever became. Eli, who was 15 by now and deeply attached to Ada, watched Clarence with the careful assessment of someone taking the measure of a thing, and by February had evidently arrived at a satisfactory conclusion, because he began talking to Clarence about ranch work with the open ease of someone who has decided not to be guarded. Ada's practice flourished. It always had, but the winter brought its particular pressures, cold and injury and the persistent respiratory ailments that plagued the mining camps in the surrounding hills, and she was busy in the way that made her alive with purpose, and Clarence watched her work with the same clear-eyed admiration he had felt since July and which had only deepened with proximity and time. She was extraordinary and she was his, and he was still, even months in, quietly amazed by both of those things. They had their difficulties. He still felt the pull of the road sometimes, and when he felt it he had learned to say so, because concealing it helped nothing, and Ada had explicitly asked for his honesty over his management of her feelings, which was a request that had made him love her more. And on those days, he would take Judas out into the desert alone for a long, hard ride and come back tired and settled in the specific way that movement accomplished for him. And Ada never made it mean more than it was. She had her own difficult days, the days when the sadness that lived behind her eyes came forward, when she was thinking of Thomas or of a patient she couldn't save, or simply of the accumulated weight of building a life in difficult country. And on those days she was quieter than usual, and he had learned to be near without crowding, to be available without requiring her to perform any particular state of being. And she had told him once, on one such evening, that his particular way of being present, without demanding anything from it, was one of the most valuable things anyone had ever offered her. He asked her to marry him in December, on the porch, in the first real cold of the Nevada winter, with his breath visible in the air, and the lantern burning above them in the particular steady way that he now associated with everything he meant by home. He did not have a ring. He had not planned the moment precisely. It had arrived when the sentence arrived, when they were standing in the cold watching the stars, and he realized that the thing he wanted most specifically in the world right now was to say this to her in this moment, and so he said it. "Ada, will you marry me?" She turned and looked at him with those eyes. "That isn't grammatically a question," she said. "I know," he said. "It isn't." The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long and felt like 4 years. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Clarence Barlow." He kissed her in the cold, and the lantern burned, and somewhere out in the dark the desert breathed its old, indifferent breath, and the stars blazed overhead with the same comprehensive disregard for human things that stars had always shown, and none of that mattered even a little. They were married in February of 1884, in the whitewashed building that served as courthouse, with Judge Holloway, who had arrived on the mail coach, doing the honors, and Hector Voss as a witness, and Eli as the other witness, and about half of Redemption Creek, who came because Ada Redmond was irreplaceable to most of them, and because people in small frontier towns take their celebrations seriously when celebrations present themselves. Ada wore a dark green dress that she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, and Clarence wore his best and only good jacket, and they stood in front of Judge Holloway and said the words, and the words landed differently from how he had ever imagined words landing, like something that was sealing rather than closing, like something that was opening rather than ending. After the wedding there was a gathering at the Blue Sage, which Hector ran with his characteristic minimalist warmth, and someone brought a fiddle, and someone else brought a guitar, and the evening became a genuine celebration, raucous and warm and full of the specific joy that people feel when something good has happened in a place where good things are hard won. Ada danced with an ease that surprised people who knew her primarily through the serious precision of her work, and Clarence danced badly and without self-consciousness, and together they were so clearly, so uncomplicatedly delighted with each other that even the most skeptical people in the room found themselves moved by it. The night ended eventually, the way nights do, and they rode home together in the February cold to the blue house that was both of theirs, and the lantern was still burning above the porch where Eli had lit it before the wedding, knowing they would come back to it after dark, because Eli had understood from the beginning the particular significance of that lamp. Spring came. The desert shifted from its winter gray into the spare and tentative color of March, and the creek on the eastern edge of the property ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and the cattle moved into the pasture with the ponderous contentment of animals returning to abundance, and Ada's practice was as busy as ever, and Clarence managed the land with the invested attention of a man who has decided this particular piece of ground is his to care for. He wrote to his mother. This was something he had not done in 7 years, not since the last exchange had been difficult and the road had made it easy to stop. His mother was alive and in New Mexico, living with a sister, and his father had died 2 years ago, which he had found out from a man who had known the family and who had given him this news as a roadside encounter somewhere in Utah. And he had felt about it a complicated and quiet thing that he had not discussed with anyone until he discussed it with Ada. He wrote to his mother because Ada had asked him once if there were people he'd left behind on the road the way he'd left places, and the question had stayed with him, and the answer was yes, and he was trying now to go back for things as well as forward. His mother wrote back. She was glad to hear from him. The letter was brief and careful, the letter of a woman who had also learned to be careful with hope, but it was there, and it was the beginning of a correspondence that would slowly, over the following year, rebuild something that had been damaged without ever being entirely destroyed. In August, Ada told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the direct simplicity she brought to important information, sitting across the table from him with both hands around her coffee cup, and she said, "I'm expecting. Spring, I think, based on the timing." He set down his own cup and looked at her and felt the kind of feeling that does not have a word and should probably not try to have one, and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I know exactly what to watch for. I am, technically, the most qualified person in Lander County to manage my own pregnancy." "That is absolutely true," he said. "I wanted you to know," she said. And for a moment the armor was off and she was looking at him with the carefully held hope of someone who has lost things and is asking the universe to be reliable this once. And he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her so their faces were level and took both her hands in his. "I am here," he said. "I am not going anywhere." "I know," she said, and she leaned her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning quiet of the kitchen with the sun coming in the east window and the sounds of the desert waking up outside. The pregnancy was not easy in its final months. Ada, who was constitutionally resistant to acknowledging physical difficulty in herself, even while she was expert at identifying it in others, was slowed by November and required, for the first time in years, to accept help with the harder physical work of the practice and property. Clarence managed the property without being asked and found a woman in town, Margaret Holt, whose husband worked the mines, who came in 3 mornings a week to help Ada with the practice's administrative work. Ada accepted this with better grace than he'd expected, which he realized was because she had decided to treat it as a practical matter rather than a concession. He stayed close. When she was awake in the night uncomfortable, he was awake with her. When she was going over patient records at the kitchen table, he sat with her. He made himself useful in the particular way she appreciated, practically and without commentary about what she should or should not be doing, because Ada Redmond did not need him to manage her, and he had always known that. Their son was born in March of 1885. Almost exactly 2 years from the morning Clarence had first knocked on the blue door with a septic wound and 52 cents. He arrived on a Sunday, with Ada assisted by Margaret Holt and a midwife named Rosa Sandoval from the mining camp 15 miles south, who had delivered over 40 children, and who Ada trusted absolutely. Clarence was in the house, not in the room because that was not how these things were done, but in the house close within hearing, and the sounds from the room where Ada labored were not reassuring in any particular way, but eventually gave way to the sound that he had not prepared himself for, the sudden outraged declaration of a new person in the world, and Rosa Sandoval came out 20 minutes later and said, "A boy. Both are well." He sat down in the kitchen chair. He happened to be nearest to and pressed both hands over his face for a moment, and then he stood up and went in. Ada was exhausted and luminous in the particular way of people who have done an enormous thing and are still vibrating with the fact of it. She had the baby in her arms already because of course she did. She had been waiting for this, and the baby was small and dark-haired, and had his eyes pressed shut against the light of the world with an expression of concentrated displeasure that made Clarence laugh before he could stop himself. "He looks extremely unhappy about this," Clarence said. "He'll adjust," Ada said. "Come here." He sat beside her, and she transferred the baby into his arms with the practiced confidence of someone who had held many newborns, and showed him how to support the head, and he held his son in the blue house in the March morning light, and felt the full and final weight of the life he had made by turning around. They named him James. James William Barlow, William for Ada's father who had taught her to survey land and ride horses and refused to be reducible to what other people imagined she could do. James was a vigorous and opinionated baby who rapidly became a vigorous and opinionated toddler, and the blue house expanded to accommodate him in the way that houses do, filling with the evidence of a child, noise and small objects, and the particular reorientation of priorities that parents experience and which Clarence found, to his continued mild surprise, entirely welcome. He was a good father. He was patient and physical with the boy, teaching him the horses early and taking him on long, slow rides through the desert when James was old enough to sit securely in the saddle. Ada taught him other things, words and numbers and the names of the plants along the creek, and James received all of this instruction with the receptive seriousness of a child who has intelligent parents and is slowly realizing what that means. The cattle operation grew. Over the next 2 years, as Lander County continued to settle, and the markets for beef improved with the expansion of the railroad through Nevada, Clarence and Ada made deliberate decisions about the property, expanding the herd and improving the infrastructure, building a proper barn and upgrading the fencing. And by 1887, they were running a small but genuinely profitable operation alongside Ada's practice. She did not slow down professionally. This had never been in serious question. Redemption Creek and its surrounding territory continued to need her, and she continued to provide, and her reputation now extended well beyond Lander County, which meant occasional long trips to see patients or consult on cases that other practitioners in the territory had found difficult. Clarence managed the home operations when she was away with the competent ease of a man who had made himself genuinely capable of running his own household. And James came to the Harker Ranch with him on those days and sat on fence posts and watched the cattle with the patient attention of a child absorbing a future. In the spring of 1887, Ada told him there would be a second child. "Spring again," she said, at the kitchen table with the same morning coffee directness, though this time there was already a smile in it, the smile of someone who knows the territory now. "March seems to favor us," he said. "March is when you arrived," she said. He looked at her across the table in the morning light, this extraordinary woman who had taken in a wounded drifter and healed him in every sense that word could be applied to person, who had built a life that was full and real and entirely her own, and then made room in it for him without diminishing a single thing about herself. And he thought about the road and the quarter-mile of desert and the lantern on the porch, and he thought about his son asleep down the hall and this new life coming in the spring. And he thought about the fact that he had sat in the dark of an October night on his horse and looked back at a small warm light and made the only choice that had ever mattered, and he said, "Ada." "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping the light on." She looked at him for a moment, and her expression was the one she wore when something reached past all her competence and all her armor and found the simple person underneath. "Someone had to," she said. "I had faith in your eventual good judgment." "Eventually is right," he said. "You arrived when you were ready," she said. "That's what matters." Their daughter was born in March of 1888, and she was named Clara, after no one in particular and both of them in general. And James, who was 3, received this development with an ambivalence that slowly converted to proprietary affection, once he understood that Clara would be following him around for the rest of his life. Clara was born with her father's gray eyes and her mother's expression, which was a combination that her parents agreed privately was going to be both beautiful and formidable. The years that followed were full. not in the way that life is sometimes full with noise and busyness that obscures a central emptiness, but in the way that life is full when it is built on something true. Ada's practice continued to grow, and she trained, in 1889, a younger woman named Patricia Osei, who had come west from Ohio with her mining engineer husband and who had medical training, and with whom Ada quickly developed the working relationship of two people who recognize each other's quality immediately. Having Patricia as a partner allowed Ada to take on the more complex cases that required extended attention, while keeping the practice's daily demands covered, and the two women became close friends in the efficient, unsentimental way of people who trust each other's competence completely. Clarence's mother came to visit in the summer of 1889. Her name was Frances, and she was a small woman who had clearly once been much younger and lighter, and who had grown her strength from harder material than most people ever had to work with. And she arrived on the mail coach from Austin with one bag, and the careful expression of someone who has decided to hope, and is defending that decision against their own experience. Clarence met the coach alone, because Ada had understood without discussion that this was something he needed to navigate first. Frances stepped down from the coach and looked at her son, who was 32 now, and who was standing in the afternoon sun of Redemption Creek taller and more settled than she had seen him in 15 years, and she started crying without warning, in the abrupt, undefended way of people who have been braced against something for so long that, when it releases them, they have no transitional mode. He held his mother on the street outside the stage office in Redemption Creek and felt something settle that he had not known was still unsettled, some account that had been outstanding for a decade. And when they had both recovered themselves, he walked her up the North Fork Road to the blue house where Ada was on the porch with James and Clara, and Ada came down the porch steps and took Frances's hands and said, "We've been looking forward to your visit," with a warmth that was entirely genuine. Because Ada Redmond had decided that Clarence's mother was someone deserving of welcome and had meant it completely, Frances stayed 3 weeks. She was wonderful with James and Clara. She and Ada developed a careful and genuine mutual respect that was based on recognizing in each other a kind of resilient intelligence. She did not talk much about the past, and no one asked her to. And on the evening before she left, she sat with Clarence on the porch after Ada had gone in to put the children to bed, and she said, "You've done something right here." "Ada did most of it," he said, which was only partly true but felt like the right thing to emphasize. "A man who knows that about his wife," Frances said, "is a man who has figured something important out." He walked her to the stage coach the next morning and she left, and he stood on the street and watched the coach go and felt the specific, complex piece of things that have been mended even if they can never be fully restored. By 1890, Redemption Creek had grown. The railroad had come within 30 miles of the town, and the mining operations in the surrounding hills had expanded, and the population had roughly doubled, and the town now had a second saloon and a school, and a genuine doctor's office that Ada had built on a lot near the center of town, rather than running her practice from her house. The new office had a waiting room and a proper examination room and a separate room for Patricia's consultations, and it was, as Ada had planned and built it to be, the best medical facility in Lander County. Clarence had been part of building it. Literally, he had done the timber framing himself with 2 hired carpenters, and also in the way that a person who has committed to a life is part of everything in it. He was known in Redemption Creek now as Ada Barlow's husband, which some men might have chafed at, given that the formulation suggested her as primary, but which Clarence found entirely accurate and not even slightly diminishing. Ada Barlow's husband was a fine thing to be. The town understood this about him, and he understood it about himself. James started school in September of 1890 and took to learning with an appetite that delighted both his parents, though for different reasons. Ada because she believed deeply in the power of an educated mind, and Clarence because watching his son discover the world of books and numbers was like watching something he himself had done on the road finally get a proper home. Clara, 2 years behind, followed her brother with the relentless determination of someone who has decided that whatever her sibling can do is also available to her. Ada and Clarence argued sometimes. This was not a defect in their marriage, but a feature of two people with strong characters and genuine respect for their own views, sharing a life and making decisions together. The arguments were not vicious and were never cruel, and they had early established, without formality, the practice of saying what they meant and then listening to what the other person said, and of not leaving a disagreement unresolved past the day it started. Ada had the more precise mind and Clarence had the more intuitive judgment, and between them they generally arrived at decisions that were better than either would have reached alone, which is what a real partnership produces. On a Wednesday evening in the October of 1890, exactly 7 years from the night he had ridden out and turned back, Clarence sat on the front porch of the blue house that was also the house he had chosen, and he watched the desert in the failing light. And Ada came out and sat in the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee and put one in his hand without being asked, and they sat in the easy silence that was their shared language as much as words ever were. "What are you thinking?" Ada said. "I'm thinking about October," he said. "7 years ago, you turned around." "I got a quarter mile," he said for the last time with the tone of a man completing a story he has told many times and still finds worth telling. "What made you turn around?" she said. She had asked this before, not many times, but she had asked, and his answers had evolved over the years as he understood it better. "The light," he said. "I looked back and saw the light on the porch, and I knew you'd left it burning for me, and I thought," he stopped, finding the right words. "I thought that was the bravest thing anyone had ever done for me, not chasing me, not asking me to stay, just leaving the light on, trusting me to make the right decision." Ada was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," she said. "I was standing there completely terrified. You didn't look it. I was inside it," she said. "The terror was on the inside. The outside had a job to do." He laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it went out into the October desert where the night was coming down cool and wide over the Toyib Range. And James's voice came from inside the house, where he was doing something with great and noisy enthusiasm, and Clara's was a counterpoint to it, and the lantern above the porch door was burning with its steady, reliable light, and Clarence Barlow, who had sworn he would never stay anywhere, who had organized his entire life around the principle of motion as safety, sat on his porch in the evening of the 7th year of the life he had chosen and felt the full weight of what he had almost not come back to, and was grateful with a depth that had no bottom. "Ada," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it properly. I love you in every way a person can mean that sentence." She turned and looked at him with those dark eyes, which were the same eyes that had assessed him from the doorway in March of 1883 and had seen, he was certain, considerably more than he had shown, and she said, "I know. I have known for a very long time." Then she said, "I love you too, Clarence, in every way." They sat with that a while, in the way that people who have earned something sit with it, without hurrying, without needing it to be more or less than it was. The lantern burned. Inside, James shouted something triumphant and Clara shouted something argumentative in return, and Ada said, "You should probably see what that is." And Clarence said, "It's probably fine." And Ada said, "It's almost certainly not fine." And they both went inside, leaving the porch to the desert night and the stars and the steady warm burning of the light that had burned through one October night 7 years ago and had never truly gone out since. There are people who say that the frontier was no place for happiness, that the West in those years of the 1880s was too hard and too uncertain, and too indifferent to human hoping for anyone to build something lasting in it. Those people are not entirely wrong about the hardness. The desert is genuinely hard. The sky is genuinely indifferent. The distances are real, and the winters are real, and the loss that comes to people building lives in difficult country is real in ways that cannot be softened by nostalgia or sentiment. But they are wrong about the happiness. Happiness was built there too, in small determined amounts, by people who were stubborn enough and honest enough and capable enough to make it from what they had. It was built by women like Ada Redmond, who could survey her own land and compound her own medicines and deliver a baby and plan a house, and stand on a dark porch in October and keep a light burning without knowing if it would be answered. And it was built by men like Clarence Barlow, who had spent 9 years running from a fear they had decided was a philosophy, and who were capable, given the right light to look back at, of turning around. James Barlow grew up to be a surveyor, which delighted Ada and surprised no one who had watched him follow her around the property with her transit at age 6, asking questions with the systematic thoroughness of a small person who intends to understand things. Clara Barlow grew up to be a physician, which surprised everyone except Ada, who had known since Clara was 4 and had begun conducting examinations on her dolls with a rolled-up piece of paper as a stethoscope. Clarence ran the cattle operation for 30 years, long enough to see the railroad come through, and the markets change and the frontier settle into something that was no longer quite the frontier. And he watched these changes with the equanimity of a man who has stopped running from things and found that, when you stop running, the world does not collapse. It simply shows you more of itself. Ada practiced medicine in Redemption Creek for 40 years, longer than anyone thought possible and shorter than she would have liked, until her hands told her they were done, and she listened to them with the same honest attention she had always given to physical reality. By then she had delivered over 300 children into Lander County, and had trained 4 practitioners who carried her standards and methods into the next generation. And Prescott at the county recorder's office had long since certified her Eastern property line for the last time and moved on. And the blue house was older and more solid, and more deeply theirs than any house had a right to be. On the porch of that house, in an October that was very late in both their lives, with the lantern burning above the door in the same place it had always burned, Ada and Clarence sat in their chairs and drank their coffee and watched the desert go golden in the evening light, and the mountains behind it went purple, and the first stars appeared in the east, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing left unsaid. And the quiet between them was as full and as true as anything that words had ever carried. The light burned. It had always burned. It would burn on.